It's Helping Hand, airing statewide on HPR1 stations as part of our afternoon drive broadcast of All Things Considered and then archived at hawaiipublicradio.org. Friday's Helping Hand puts the spotlight on an organization, topic, or event that offers assistance to people with disabilities and people and animals that are among the most vulnerable. I'm Dave Lawrence. This week on Helping Hand, it's a topic, perhaps the most vulnerable resident on Earth, the pangolin. It's the world's only scaled mammal. It's a creature that many people have never heard of, though often find endearing once discovered. Pangolins are facing an existential poaching crisis. It's caused by consumers in the Asia-Pacific, largely in China, who are eating these shy, toothless animals into extinction, wiping them out of their habitats on a global level, despite international protections for all pangolins. These consumers claim their scales have some medicinal power, but if they do, it's somehow eluded scientific proof of any kind, and pangolin products are used despite alternative remedies that don't rely on killing endangered species. Today, we're welcoming one of the leaders of an international network of journalists working on a series of reports to document the poaching, smuggling, and consumption of pangolins. The Global Environmental Reporting Collective's work can be found online at pangolinreports.com, and there's a lot of it. It includes Traffic to Extinction, a long-form, highly interactive web report. It's a presentation with lots of reports inside of it, stuff to click on. It uses animated graphics to both explain the huge uptick in the volume of pangolins being trafficked, but also to expose smuggling routes, the corrupt law enforcement often enabling this, and offering a closer look at exactly where in China these shipments are headed. These news reports are being posted all the time at pangolinreports.com, and today we're joined by Patrick Bowler. He's both an executive editor and member of the editorial board of SWI, SwissInfo.ch, the international news service of Switzerland's public broadcaster, but he's a co-founder of this Global Environmental Reporting Collective, author of PangolinReports.com. Aloha and welcome to Helping Hand, Patrick. Thank you for taking time for us.
Hi, Dave. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And in some ways, what you guys are doing is kind of like a community service because you've created this ongoing resource, gigantic thing, almost like an encyclopedia of current news that relates to an animal that's in deep trouble, that's really incapable of telling its own story. So thinking of the pangolins that in a lot of ways you and these other journalists are speaking for, explain how this collective came together and why you ended up focusing on the pangolins.
So I should say that I used to live in Asia. We just recently relocated to Switzerland, and we've met regularly as a group of investigative journalists, and we've long wanted to collaborate, look for topics that we could collaborate on. And we've been looking for the right story to work together for quite some time. It will be a story that requires international reporting, but it's also something that is hard to cover locally by the local media outlets on their own. We met at a conference, at an investigative conference in Seoul, South Korea last year. And one of my colleagues, Karen Jiang, who is our lead reporter in Hong Kong, she mentioned that she's been doing reporting on pangolins. And truth be told, before we had these conversations, I never gave pangolins any thought. I knew they existed, but I didn't know about the problems and the dangers they face and that they're very close to extinction and why they're close to extinction. It's such a bizarre story. So we got together, the group of journalists mostly in Asia, and we thought, how can we cover this story together? And as we were talking with some colleagues, it got bigger and bigger, and people were interested because everyone we talked to heard of anecdotal evidence that pangolins are either being poached in their countries or they were seized at airports, at ports. So we're like, why would these harmless animals with no medicinal value whatsoever, and probably I've never eaten a pangolin, but I can't imagine they taste very good. Why would they be trafficked? So this is kind of how we started out, and we've been reporting on the trade ever since.
And I can't emphasize enough the scope of how much material there is at pangolinreports.com. And there's the Traffic to Extinction report. There's a series of newer ones, very animated, super user-friendly, the graphics, a lot of things that move
Thank you.
that you can follow. Oh, you're welcome. The countries that your reporters are in, Lay that out for folks so they get an idea how wide-ranging your reporting is throughout Asia on this.
We have reported now so it's 15 currently countries and territories in Asia and Africa. In Africa, we report from Cameroon and Nigeria. In Asia, it's pretty much all over Southeast Asia, in China. And the trickiest part by far was reporting in China. That's the most challenging environment because the media environment is very, very tightly controlled. So if you do reporting, you have to really be very, very careful. And the other tricky part is that most of the trade in Southeast Asia that we've come across is connected to organized crime. So you think, oh, it's a story about a harmless animal, but this harmless animal is trafficked by often crime syndicates where you really have to be very, very careful. So it is also, while it is a story that people associate with this cute animal, it is at the same time also a very dangerous story to report in some parts of the world. For instance, if you read out reporting in Indonesia, you'll find ties to huge drug trafficking syndicates. And that's also another aspect why we should care about this story, because if you think about it, if a crime syndicate can smuggle a ton of pangolin scales from Nigeria to Singapore or to China, they can transport pretty much anything, right? So there is also a bigger crime story that's connected to pangolin smuggling.
Who is providing the funding for the Global Environmental Reporting Collective?
We got some support from ADM Capital Foundation, which is a foundation that supports environmental awareness issues. But most of the support came from news organizations themselves. So we worked with 14 news organizations in Asia and Africa, and they provided the manpower and they paid the salaries of these reporters, right? So it was both the news organizations and we got some additional funding to help report the story.
And just for the listener's sake, because we're right in the Asia Pacific, run down the names of, I know you said China and you named Cameroon and Nigeria in Africa. Name the other countries in Southeast Asia that you guys have reporters.
Yes, sure. In Indonesia, we worked with Tempo, which is a leading magazine. We also work with Manga Bay. They do fantastic environmental reporting. They had one of their reporters in Indonesia joined us. In the Philippines, we work with Rappler. In Malaysia, we work with Rage, kind of the innovative online arm of The Star. In Taiwan, we worked with an online news outlet called The Reporter, Boroja, which is a fantastic, fantastic investigative publication. In Hong Kong, we worked with the South China Morning Post. I used to be a reporter there.
Right.
In Vietnam, we worked with a media think tank, MDI. They were in turn worked with local media. So we wouldn't work directly with media outlets, but through them with local media. And in Thailand, we work with Thai Publica. It's also a rather new investigative outlet. And in Myanmar, we work with the Shan Herald, which is a local media publication in Myanmar's Shan state in the Golden Triangle region. And we work with Myanmar Now, which is a fantastic publication based in Yangon and where we just wrapped up some undercover reporting. I think I'm through all the publication.
It's incredible. No, it's
anyone. Yeah.
You've got a real it's a web throughout Asia, but it's just to paint a picture for folks because it's really an Asia Pacific story. Although it is the animals are being gobbled up on a global level, they're all headed into Asia. So throughout 2019, we have heard about massive pangolin seizures in Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia. It would seem like it was a volume never before documented. But then when you look at pangolinreports.com, explain how your investigation basically shows it's true, that there is a huge increase in pangolin trafficking that took place in 2019, far exceeding even 2018's record-setting seizures and anything documented previously.
That is correct. We only have this anecdotal evidence of these seizures, so we can only assume the extent of the actual trade, which was probably much, much bigger than what we know of. And what we can see is really that the demand is so large that these animals are shipped from further and further afield. So the shipments that you mentioned in Vietnam and in Singapore, those came from Nigeria. If you follow the arrest reports across Southeast Asia, you'll see that Really, the demand is forcing poachers to go further and further afield to find pangolins. And it's the same as one of the findings we had even in Cameroon, is that these middlemen, these poachers, it's getting much harder for them to actually buy the animals because they're being bought up all over the place. There's so many reports. I mean, when we publish, people are getting in touch. Just today, someone from Uganda got in touch and someone from Zambia telling us all this anecdotal evidence. And what we're working on is trying to really create a global picture of this demand. But it is really hard because it's just this gray zone where we'll never know how many of them actually being trafficked.
And they don't even know how many exist. But what you've said is
Correct, yeah.
more and more they're having a hard time finding them. And you did a tally on how many pangolins were killed in 2019, according to PangolinReports.com. It looked like 100 and
Definitely.
some
Yes.
thousand animals. You guys studied the pangolin trade going back like 2 decades, and basically it's only been going up, and in the last 3 years just skyrocketing, especially since they received their global protection.
Yes. So we've talked to experts about it, and they were telling us these skyrocketing numbers could also be caused by better law enforcement. So we don't really know. So these numbers are not necessarily an indicator of skyrocketing demand. So we thought maybe perhaps that is part of the reason. But another reason is that law enforcement has finally caught onto the issue, and they're reporting on these seizures, and they'd let the public know that these things are happening. And then I have to say there's better law enforcement also in China. So there are more cases, and we know of more incidents and seizures and rapes. Of course, they wouldn't happen if there wasn't any demand. And it's definitely what we found certainly indicates that the demand has pushed the trade up.
Well, on the note of the demand, and you guys are covering this throughout Asia, and you've explained they're pulling these animals from wherever they can find them after exhausting them in lots of places in Asia. They're getting them from Africa now. As for the consumer countries that are driving all this killing, where is the demand coming from?
You rightly alluded to it in your perfect introduction. It's China. Most of the consumption, as far as we can tell, is happening in China. We just wrapped up some reporting in Myanmar. And what we saw there across the country was those pangolins are not consumed locally. They're all shipped to China. And the same all over the place. We found some domestic consumption in Vietnam. But for instance, you think about in Malaysia, you found some poachers who used to sell pangolins to middlemen who would then sell the pangolins onto China. But they recently stopped because they realized there is no such tradition in their culture, and it actually goes against their culture. And they have been so hard to find these pangolins, so rare that they stopped trading them. So it really, for what we can tell, most of them go to China.
And you guys have this statement in there. It says, quote, despite the scale of the trade, little is actually known about it, even among prosecutors and law enforcement officials in its key market, China. Explain how you just set it up that all of these pangolins virtually are headed there, and yet in China, it's kind of an unusual setup in terms of how legal this is and how much is known about the trade.
Yes. So I should say that the trafficking of importing pangolins and pangolin scales to China is illegal because the animal is an endangered species. So what we did is we got a data journalist to get us all the court records, the public court records in China that related to the smuggling of pangolins. And it's in the hundreds. The last couple of years, and we tried to analyze the amount of pangolin scales and whatever we could find out about these people and from wherever they are, and really paint a picture. The picture the data paints is really that even prosecutors and the authorities know very little about the trade, and they're really just touching the surface of what is actually happening. We also saw that in border towns, if you go to the Vietnamese-Chinese border or the Burmese-Chinese border, you can see that the trade is happening quite openly. So it's either not a priority in those places or law enforcement struggles to contain the trade.
China has a strange set of circumstances as to the legality of pangolin products, as Patrick sort of alluded to. CITES just recently said that China's National Forestry and Grassland Administration is considering uplisting pangolins to a Class 1 nationally protected species. That would prohibit all commercial trade. Earlier in the year, it was also announced that some insurance in China would no longer cover treatment with pangolin products. But as it stands, you said it's illegal to import them. How are those places? Like, for example, you talked to this one guy, a supplier for traditional Chinese medicine in China. He said their products
That's
require
right.
hundreds of kilograms of pangolin scales per month. Where are they legally allowed to get them from?
So that's a very, very good question. And that is basically the key question in China that is very hard to give you a definitive answer on. And we certainly don't have one. So there are legal stockpiles of pangolin scales, of existing pangolin scales. And as far as I understand, it's local governments that issue these permits to buy from those stockpiles. But it doesn't exactly add up because these stockpiles cannot possibly be so big as to be able to supply all of these pharmaceutical companies that use that process pangolin scales. So we can only guess as to where they actually come from. And we're still reporting on that. But what we can tell from our reporting so far is that there are large amounts of pangolin scales enter China illegally and somehow end up in a market where they are processed and sold. It is very hard to link those illegally imported pangolins with specific pharmaceutical companies. But it seems sometimes to be the obvious conclusion that some of these companies probably source their scales in that way.
I mean, they can't all be from China because the animal is all but extinct in China. So, I mean, these
Correct.
hundreds of kilograms of scales per month, obviously they're coming from somewhere else. I mean, it just shows you what these
Correct.
animals are up against. Another thing at pangolinreports.com.
I should say that was a smaller company. That was like a mid-sized, mid to smaller companies. There are much larger companies that have a much larger turnover as well. This was a small player.
Right. You're talking about the smuggling of tons and tons of pangolins just in each of these shipments, and these shipments representing only a fraction of the trafficking that's going on. One can imagine there are many tons that are getting through. One of the things that you
Absolutely.
offer on this note of the consumption, and you've pointed to China as being the top consumer by far, with, according to your reporting and what you've offered today, only some minor consumption in Vietnam, the rest is in China. You have this former director of the School of Chinese Medicine at the University of Hong Kong who said
Yes.
there is no scientific research that supports the claim that pangolin scales have healing properties. And in your reporting, he said that traditional Chinese medicine practitioners in Hong Kong and mainland China have largely stopped prescribing medications with pangolin scales, but pharmaceutical companies have continued to produce drugs with the scales. And you quote him, and he says, quote, "TCM professionals need to speak up to defend the good name of the Chinese medicine," said Dr. Lau. How widely shared were his views when it came to your reporting, or is he an anomaly?
That is a great question. And amongst these traffickers, the sad thing is they just wouldn't care. They just don't care. They have an incentive in telling their potential clients that if you have all kinds of ailments, you should try some of this medicine with pangolin scales. It's very special. And this usually works because these people just make more money because these scales are quite expensive. So on the grassroots level, I think that it seems like these traffickers have an incentive to sell the scales,
But
right?
I meant in China, when it
Yeah.
comes to traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, to have one guy saying this stuff is snake oil and we should clear our good name for this medicine by not
Mm.
prescribing it anymore. Did you find any other people who had that kind of opinion, or was he kind of an outlier? Was that an unusual opinion for him to say that this stuff doesn't really work?
We've met a good amount of people, of practitioners to traditional Chinese medicine, who also said that these scales at most have a placebo effect. But of course, these people wouldn't be heard by
Right. I get you.
the average consumer.
Right, and I get it. I just was curious because it was like, you see
Yeah,
you see a handful of bright spots and an awful dark nightmarish report, and so forgive me for just trying to.
absolutely.
I'm just searching for something positive in the whole thing. And then there's
No, but it is changing. It is slowly changing.
it
There
is.
is a growing awareness of animal rights in China that is hopefully going to be one of the big stories going forward, that people are becoming more aware of these things. And hopefully this absolutely pointless, senseless trade becomes less. I mean, we had some slow good news on ivory trade in other cases. And so there is reason to be optimistic in the long run.
It is in movement. You pointed out a couple things. One, the reporting is just ratcheted up to a much higher level, so there's more reporting of it, which can blur how much is actually going on because more reporting might compensate for why you hear about more busts, and there's more attention on enforcement. Also, legislation is changing. But there's another thing that's happening too. At pangolinreports.com, in your Traffic to Extinction report, you detail how Chinese demand is fueling poaching in far-flung places, with Chinese and other criminal syndicates operating from Cameroon and Nigeria all the way to the remote jungles of Malaysia and the Philippines. And as we hear more and more about the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, with China taking on projects stretching to Africa and even more Chinese nationals set to live in these countries, talk about the role that Chinese business people in African cities and in Asian pangolin source markets have been playing in enabling the smuggling back to China.
So we have found anecdotal evidence in some places that it's Chinese sellers. So that's what our reporting in Nigeria has shown and in Cameroon. We had to be very, very careful to say that these are not necessarily Chinese syndicates, but mostly international syndicates, where I would imagine that you have customers in China or middlemen with good contacts in China sourcing locally in those countries. That was definitely the case in Indonesia, but also sometimes where you have Chinese traders in those countries. So it's a mixed picture. For instance, there was some resentment. We talked to Nigerian poachers at a market in Nigeria, and there was some resentment amongst Nigerian poachers telling us that the Chinese poachers are making their lives so hard because they're taking away all their market share. So it is a mixed picture. There is also the difficulty in those countries that there are, of course, a lot of Chinese traders and business people in those countries that do absolutely legitimate trade, right? So there's always the danger when you report on these criminal networks that, especially if you write for local audiences in those countries, that these things get conflated to Chinese traders overall, right? And that is certainly not the case. It's a small group of people, and they are both from local and from international backgrounds, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And it's true. There are Chinese people working in all these countries, you're saying, who have nothing to do with the trade. And you have to walk a fine line to make sure that people don't assume every Chinese person who's working in Africa or in these other
Exactly.
source countries is there to get pangolins. That's not the case. But at the same time, from reading your report, it looks like Chinese demand is displacing local traders where the pangolins are found. And in some cases, like Malaysia, for example, which is, in addition to a transit stop, actually home to a lot of native pangolins, or was home to a lot.
That's right.
Explain how your report quotes a Malaysian university lecturer who said that this recent Chinese demand has brought Malaysia's pangolins to the brink of extinction.
That is right. That's also why China has been considering uplifting the threat level of the Malaysian pangolin, because so many of these pangolins are going to China. But at the same time, if you read our reporting in Malaysia, you'll also see that people are starting to say no. So you have these indigenous communities, the Temiars in Malaysia. For them, they link the pangolin to the human fetus. So they believe it to be the reincarnation of the human placenta. So it's very important to them, and it's very rich in mythology. So they recently started to say, some of them told us that they'd rather lose the revenue but protect the animal. And that to us was a very, very moving revelation
Yep.
that people are saying, we don't need to do this. And if you look at, for instance, at Taiwan, Taiwan had a huge trafficking problem with the pangolins. And one of the things they did is they provided alternative sources of income to the traffickers and poachers. So the problem slowly went away because people had alternatives. And that is a great thing. And that is perhaps a model for other countries. But there in Malaysia, seeing that these people said, no, no money can, this is not worth it, is also something that we found quite inspiring.
It was a bright spot, and to see some of the reporting that's coming, it looks like out of your Malaysian correspondence, in particular one that's worth giving a plug to, The Pangolin and the Dark World of Trafficking, one of these highly interactive presentations in like a storybook form. A lot of the times when you hear about Malaysia and the pangolins, you're hearing about the shipments that are caught as they go through there. Like we were talking about the ones coming from Africa and they stop there as a transit country. But they actually, as you said, they had quite a few pangolins. And it's nice to see some of these people realizing that the pangolin has a spiritual connection to them that they don't want to lose. And I think that's been, for all of these animals, has been the way to find success in conservation, is to have people develop an attachment to them. But on the other side, an example you show is the way that corrupt law enforcement, I guess throughout the reporting that you're doing, you show that it's corrupt law enforcement that's often enabling what's happening. In one instance, on the Malaysia-Thai border, 3 Malaysian cops, all these cops working from one Malaysian police station, and your investigative work suggests there's a larger smuggling ring made up of cops and law enforcement.
That's right. That's right. We talked to some of these officers as well, and they literally told us what it was like to transport these and facilitate the transport of these animals from Malaysia to Thailand. And then our colleagues in Thailand did some follow-up reporting there, talking to the police. And it turns out it is just this huge, huge market. And these officers, they're probably small players in a much bigger market. And that is, again, something that is deeply worrying me when I think about this trade. They're the pangolins, and there's this huge market around them where so much crime can exist that is not seen, that is in the darkness, that we just see a little bit of. And that is what's really, if you think about the overall issue, that is really worrying.
There are, as you point out, few, if any, of these law enforcement officials who are corrupt seeming to get punished, as your report details, in particular the Philippines. And I should point out, at pangolinreports.com, the reporting, it's ongoing. So in addition to Traffic to Extinction and some of these other new reports, they have another new one that just came out on the Philippines, where pangolins are hunted even under the watch of local authorities, who find it very difficult. As you pointed out, the trade is so massive around these animals, it's a bit overwhelming, the way that every kind of law enforcement seems to get corrupted.
I thought what's particularly interesting about the fantastic reporting by Rappler from the island of Palawan is that they really look at the tensions that exist because of environmental conservation, pits communities against their elected officials. So we have here poachers, and they might not be aware of this being illegal, more or less, at least that's what they tell us. But if the local politicians and if the local officials try to act, they will be punished at the ballot box, because these communities, you're taking away their livelihoods. And I thought that was such an interesting case where elected officials don't have an incentive to crack down on illegal poaching because of how the system is set up. And hopefully with our reporting, people are starting to talk about this issue, and we have some more reports coming up soon. And we're really hoping that if move the needle a little bit in those communities towards awareness that this is wrong and what this is part of.
Well, on that awareness, that's a very good lead in to, again, sometimes people are not aware of where these sources are coming from. You constantly hear of this Chinese demand having wiped out most of the pangolins in China and throughout Southeast Asia, and as if most of it's coming from Africa. But an official at Indonesia's Environment and Forestry Ministry is quoted in pangolinreports.com as saying, quote, he estimates that Indonesia is the world's largest illicit exporter of pangolin meat and scales, even though pangolins in Indonesia cannot compete with the African subspecies in terms of size. Shipments mostly go to China, sometimes through Vietnam and Hong Kong. Is this guy implying the sheer number of pangolins being killed in Indonesia makes them the largest exporter?
I think that's what he is implying.
So there are quite a few of them being
Mhm.
sourced from Indonesia as well. So those two countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, are two big source countries in Asia.
And that really points to the issue that if we then go back and look at our court records from China, that kind of give us a picture of what is happening, like what the prosecutors and the courts are seeing. They're not seeing much from Indonesia. So it remains a complete black box. And it was only thanks to the fantastic reporting by our colleagues at Tempo, who are deeply sourced and have contacts in the police, that we could find out more about these poachers' ties to organized crime.
And that organized crime, that's a great point, because at pangolinreports.com, you can watch, as Patrick's sort of alluding to, as you click through the report, you can literally trace with this animated graphics the path that the smuggling is taking as the pangolins go. They identify whether they're going by air, by car, by boat. It's fascinating, the different routes. And it also often involves, as you said, people who are selling drugs and weapons, like the India-Myanmar border. That's one area that you covered. But you also pointed out something else that's important. Sometimes with these large shipments, and thinking about Indonesia again, suspects in the smuggling can be major business people. You go over the case of an owner of a frozen fish export company in Indonesia. He appears to act
Yeah,
with impunity, and we're talking about large numbers of animals, correct?
that is right. That is right. We're talking about our sources in the police have traced transfers in the millions of dollars between this man and his companies and suspected intermediaries. But it is still unclear whether this person is being investigated. And it's just extremely hard to pin down where the money really comes from, like how to follow the money trail in these groups, because it's just so, so obscure.
Yeah, that chain of
Um,
custody is
with-
everything, is what you're pointing out.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So in this case, I can only assume that police officers themselves are getting frustrated about how these people are getting away.
Right, and
And that's
getting
why they talk to us.
huge volumes too. And you pointed out something in this about how it's very hard to follow who is actually running this because so many people are passing it off. You quote this guy, Emerson Tsai,
Yes.
executive director of the Philippine Center for Terrestrial and Aquatic Research. And on the note of what you were just saying, he reflected it's usually the low-level poachers or smugglers who get caught. And he told you guys, quote, "We have to find the ones who order the hunting, those who finance it, because if you don't arrest them, poaching will never end." And in any case that you covered, were any of the financiers or major players actually caught?
No, no, unfortunately,
Unbelievable.
not a
It's
single case. Yeah.
and you also in your reporting show, and a critical part of maybe the explosion of this, you point to the internet and in particular apps hugely popular in China like WeChat that are
Mhm.
popular ways to sell the pangolins and coordinate the smuggling.
That's a very, very good point you make there. This is also a huge challenge for law enforcement because if the trade is happening on WeChat in Chinese, imagine police in Cameroon
Right.
or local police in Indonesia. It's so much harder to get access to those conversations if there's a court order or just to infiltrate these groups that are operating on WeChat. And the other thing that is really hard is tracing those money transfers again. That is something that we haven't done enough reporting for me to be confident to talk about. But I would think that if you operate on a messaging platform that is not much used otherwise in the country, then it's of course you're operating in a safer space.
Well, you have this newest report, The Pangolin and the Dark World of Trafficking. And speaking of a high
Yeah.
level Malaysian trafficker, on the note of what you're talking about, they call themselves Kejora Pets. And it says in your report, he advertises his animals on social media, complete with photos, fire sale style copy, and a phone number through which he takes orders on messaging apps. He receives payment via online bank transactions, arranges for delivery via third parties, never physically handles the animals. In short, the law is based on possession there. And so this guy can get away with that. And does your reporting reveal this is typical for how this is getting done? Because basically the law says if you can't get caught with the pangolins, then you can do all this crafty way of selling it.
Well, first, this is, of course, a group that is very skillful, where you see that even the people lower down in the food chain, in the hierarchy of these groups, are already taking measures like this to elude capture. But then, of course, poachers elsewhere don't appear to be as sophisticated as they are in Malaysia. But then, of course, if you go higher up the hierarchies, it's just so hard to find out who is responsible, who is not just the person, what we call them, the mules, the people who are just
Right.
doing the job of selling the pangolin on behalf of someone else or transporting the pangolin on behalf of someone else. It's just really hard.
Yeah, that's part of what the tracking it through country after country. Andrea Crosta, who's an investigator with what was Elephant Action League, they have a new name, but it's a nonprofit that does undercover investigation to track smuggling. And that's really how these guys often get away with it, is there's so many borders involved. And before we wrap it up with you, Vietnam is often seen as the top marketplace for illegal endangered wildlife. And from your reporting and what you told us today, Vietnam is really a second player in this pangolin thing. That there are some pangolins being consumed there, but it seems like it's more Chinese buyers, because you have one guy who's a seller. He's quoted as saying, "You can wait at home in China. We deliver to your doorstep."
That's right. Yes. This was one of the big surprises reporting this story, was going to that border, the Vietnamese-Chinese border. You can really tell there's a long-running smuggling tradition at that border. So there's long-standing smuggling operations there. But you see the Chinese customs, they put barriers in the middle of the river just to make sure that they can control possible deliveries across the river and intercept them. But on the other hand, the smuggling is completely in the open on both sides of the border. So you can order on the one side of the border, or you can get the deliveries on the other. And it really seems that one of the main routes right now is the one going from the Laotian border through Vietnam to China. We collected media reports in Vietnam on arrests and seizures, and we tried to visualize them. And if you follow those reports, you actually really see a very distinct route that these smugglers are taking. And of course, these arrests are only anecdotal evidence, and they suggest a much bigger trade of pangolins coming from Laos and going through Vietnam to China.
People can follow these reports online. It's pangolinreports.com. And at that website, you'll find the link to their incredible and highly interactive Trafficked to Extinction report, where you can literally click away and follow the pangolins being smuggled through these different countries, get little stories in each place, and find out more about how corrupt law enforcement enables this and how local traders are being, in some cases, pushed out of the way by international crime syndicates. You'll also find their storybook formatted The Pangolin in the Dark World of Trafficking, and links to many of the latest reports that you guys are doing. And so on that note, looking at the size of it, for the Global Environmental Reporting Collective, it seems like you could really make the pangolin your focus. But what else is to come? Is there going to be more? And could we stay in touch with you so that we can be sort of part of your network to get the material out, since it's an Asia story?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to be in touch, and we'd love to share our stories. One of the core principles that we set ourselves was that we share our reporting. We want this to be known and read and discussed wherever there is interest in as many people as possible. So we actually wanted to work on this project for a couple of months, for about half a year last year. But we got more requests from other media. They said, we have anecdotal evidence here and we can't make sense of it. So we ended up working with them. So we still have some reporters in the field reporting in various countries, and it looks like we'll be working on this for quite some time. The goal being that we really want to raise awareness and use our local resources in these countries to report really deeply on this complex issue. And hopefully next time we talk, we'll have also some better answers on how these syndicates operate. Because if we don't understand how they operate, and if we don't have a better understanding of how this trade is working, not only can we not curb the trafficking of pangolins, not only can we protect the species, but also that would mean accepting that organized crime can ship tons of produce of whatever it is across the world completely undetected. And that should also be very, very troubling to a lot of us, of course.
Right, you point out goes far beyond pangolins. Could be nuclear material. It's a very good point what you're describing there. Well, people can hear the full interview, get the radio feature, get all the links to pangolinreports.com at our website. Your email is contact@pangolinreports.com for people who are interested in contacting the organization. And if there are any people who are listening to the segment who are concerned that the funding may run out for the reporting of this and they wanted to make sure the pangolin story gets out, could they contact you guys regarding being a funding source?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes, absolutely. That would be fantastic. We were so much buried in reporting that we completely neglected everything else. So any support we get is highly appreciated. It doesn't go to any salaries. We haven't used any funding support we have received for salaries. The funding that we have received has supported the reporting costs of our reporters in the field. So it's paid for a Chinese journalist reporting in Vietnam. It's paid for reporters talking to poachers in Cameroon. We went undercover in Malaysia and bought a pangolin from a poacher. And of course, we handed them over to the authorities and reported this person's details to the authorities. So it's also helped us free some pangolins. And so, yeah, absolutely. That would be fantastic. Aloha, everyone. It's Patrick Bowler, co-founder of the Global Environmental Reporting Collective. And I was a guest right here on this show, All Things Considered, as part of Helping Hand with my friend David Lawrence. I was speaking about our ongoing coverage of a major Asia-Pacific conservation crisis, the pangolin poaching epidemic, which is found online at pangolinreports.com. If you appreciate journalism that raises the profile of endangered species like the pangolin, I urge you to support this show right now. Finding outlets to cover conservation emergencies like this is critical on our shared planet. Here's how to do your part, and on behalf of our international team of journalists at pangolinreports.com, I say thanks for your helping hand.
And so people can find the full interview, the radio feature, all their contact information, and all of our previous Helping Hand guests at hawaiipublicradio.org. And it is a very interactive series of reports. I really can't credit you enough for making this the kind of thing that's engaging for people and makes people want to take a look at it. It draws you in because you can kind of watch with the animated graphics how the smuggling happens, and then you do this other new thing, this new book kind of format, the pangolin and the dark world of trafficking. So it's just presented in such a creative way. I can't emphasize enough to you. I think it's very interesting that you guys would do this in this kind of way that can really help an animal that I don't think there's a more vulnerable creature. And so again, people can go to pangolinreports.com to learn about the work of the Global Environmental Reporting Collective. And we've had their co-founder, Patrick Bowler, as our very special guest on Helping Hand today. Of all the things that we've talked about, and we certainly have talked about a lot, is there any certain point or issue that you just wanted to get out there relating to this conservation emergency that you're covering?
I think the most critical point is that we need to think about these places where the pangolins are poached. These poachers, the low-level people, I'm not talking about the crime syndicates, but these poachers who hunt and sell the pangolins locally, to really address that problem, we need to think about what else can they do, right? How else can they make a decent living? So if we want to really eradicate this problem, deal with the problem, I think it's very, very important to think about alternative sources of income for these people. And it is really something that I've been thinking about all this time. Is there's this outrage in me, there's this rage because of this pointless trade. But then also on another level, I understand these people in the markets in Nigeria. I understand the people in these indigenous hunters in Malaysia, that they just want to make a living. So I think really part of this conversation has to be how do we help these people to find alternative sources of income?
It's the same deal with the elephants, the rhinos. It's really it's a,
Absolutely.
it's a very universal point. And I can see you've become very passionate from a guy who was just introduced to it. And I know the feeling. I was covering the rhino poaching thing and still am very passionate, but I kept hearing about the pangolins. And then once you discover they're a very endearing creature. It's hard to turn away from them once you see one, especially the one you've got on the cover of that Traffic to Extinction in the blue tote. It's like in a blue plastic tote, and he's just staring up at all those people. That's the one you bought and saved, huh?
Yes. You're referring to the one in our global story at the top?
Yeah, the one that you can see, he's sitting in a blue tote and at night, and he's just looking up at everyone. That's the one that you guys bought in Malaysia from the guy online and then released, correct?
No, this is one from Vietnam.
That's a Vietnam one.
That's one in Vietnam that was saved by a local NGO in Vietnam. This one actually ended up in a poacher's trap, and the trap nearly cut off its leg. So this NGO's vets had to amputate the foot, right, the front leg of the animal. And for us, this was really just watching that footage of this poor animal, that what you see there is really, it's very sad. The pangolin there who just lost its leg, and at least it was lucky in that it was found and saved by this NGO.
That's the one on the cover in that blue tote.
On the cover, yes.
And that's
the global story you're referring to. If you're referring to the
Traffic to
one
Extinction.
that has all the countries. Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, and that was Save Vietnam's Wildlife you're talking about, who saved it.
That's right.
Man, well, that animal couldn't end up in better. There is no better hands to be in than that organization, I would say. If you're
is that right?
Yeah. I've had them on the show, and around the world, as you know, they're a very hard to keep in captivity animal. And I mean, that was one of the highlights we didn't really cover, but the fact that Taiwan has made so much progress in doing that. Well, if you go back and you want to see somebody else who is an expert at it, Save Vietnam's Wildlife they have many pangolins they've been able to keep alive for years and years and years. I mean, they have a formula. They can buy the ants because, as you know, people in Vietnam eat the ants. They actually eat the ants in the south of Vietnam. So they have a great food source. They've got the vets. They're, that animal couldn't have been, there are very few people who know what they're doing like that. If I was a pangolin, I wouldn't want to be, I couldn't imagine.
This is, if I can just quickly tell another anecdote.
Please.
Is something that really gave me hope is in China, they rescued a couple of pangolins in Guangdong province in the south of China, and they were taken in by student volunteers that started to take care of these animals, and it was as you said, it's really hard to take care of these animals. So they found people who volunteered to collect ants in another part of China where they thought, these are the right ants for these animals. And so you had volunteers collecting the ants, freezing the ants, and sending them to the zoo where these pangolins were being cared for by these volunteers. And these volunteers were students of a Chinese veterinary training institution, and I thought this is really inspiring, and it gave me hope in terms of there's also a new generation in China that has a totally different level of awareness around these issues, and looking for the right ants, freezing them, and sending them across China. It takes a lot of passion and dedication to do that.
Oh, it totally does, and it also takes a lot of passion and dedication to put together something like PangolinReports.com. And please pass along to the authors of the storybook, "The Pangolin in the Dark World of Trafficking," which is one of your recent reports. Also, my sincere gratitude that people are being passionate about an animal that really needs a helping hand. If there's any creature on the planet that needs people to stand up for it, that's highly vulnerable, it would seem these guys are. And you're doing a great thing. And so my best to everybody there at the Global Environmental Reporting Collective, Patrick Bowler, co-founder, and pangolinreports.com, his ongoing work. We'll stay in touch with you, but on behalf of all the pangolins who you're getting their story out there, they can't get on the radio, they can't ask for help, they can't hire an ad agency, they can't do any of that stuff. Thank you so much both for your time today, but what you're doing, it's inspiring, Patrick. You're doing something very selfless with your talents, and I appreciate it personally.
You're very kind. Thank you so much for having me and having us on this great program.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then I'll stay in touch. I'll send you the link to it. And like I said, I'll have like about a 10-minute feature on air, but then the full interview will also be there, and I'll post it both on our website and on YouTube, and hopefully then you can share the links. And like I said, I think that the full interviews are excellent resources because there are people who are becoming more passionate about it. And this is a great, in some ways, an online, audio storybook that accompanies what you've done, because now you've told your story yourself.
Oh, fantastic.
Fantastic. And I hope that you can use that audio to help you too.
What we'll do is we have a newsletter. We have a newsletter, and that goes out to conservationists at international organizations and NGOs. And if you send me that link, I'll make sure I'll send it to everyone in that newsletter and kind of spread the word that you're interested in, because I thought the questions you ask are really good, and some of the questions I wish we'd have better answers for, but it's just such an obscure story. It's just so hard to get to the bottom of it.
Well, we'll stay in touch and we'll do more on it, and that's very kind of you, because I'm very passionate about it too. So I give you a big hug and a high five, and I think it's a great resource, because people who care about this will want to hear it. And you said a lot of stuff, and so kudos, my brother. Stay on top of it. And
thank you so much.
We'll be in touch soon.
We'll talk soon then.
God bless you, brother.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.